Good afternoon and welcome to the 18th Annual Library of Congress National Book Festival. I'm Meredith Hindley. I'm with the National Endowment for the Humanities, or you might better know us as NEH. NEH is proud to sponsor this year's Understanding Our World stage. For those of you who don't know, NEH is a small independent federal agency. We fund programs in preservation, research, education, and public programming, documentaries, films. The humanities, of course, are the reason that we're here today, because it's literature, history. It's the reason that we all love books. As a historian, I am particularly excited about this afternoon's panel, which features Clarence Page, Isabel Wilkerson, and Brooks Dee Simpson in conversation about America's first great struggle for racial equality. Isabel Wilkerson is the author of The Warmth of Other Suns, an epic account of the Great Migration that saw millions of African Americans leave the South in search of a better life elsewhere. The book appeared on more than 30 Best of the Year lists and won the National Book Critics Circle's Award. Wilkerson also won the Pulitzer Prize for her work as Chicago bureau chief of the New York Times, making her the first Black woman in the history of American journalism to win the Pulitzer Prize and the first African American to win for individual reporting. She is also a recipient of a 2000, yeah, right? She's also the recipient of a 2015 National Humanities Medal, which is given out by NEH in conjunction with the White House. Brooks Dee Simpson is a professor of Civil War Studies at Arizona State University. He has written and edited 16 books about the Civil War and Reconstruction, including Ulysses S. Grant, Triumph Over Adversity, which was named a New York Times notable book. He has recently edited Reconstruction, Voices from America's First Great Struggle for Racial Equality for the Library of America. The book is a compilation of more than 100 contemporaneous letters, diary entries, interviews, petitions, testimony, and newspaper and magazine articles by the famous and not so famous. NEH helped launch the Library of America more than 3 decades ago, and this new volume continues its tradition of documenting, publishing, and celebrating American voices. Our moderator for today is Clarence Page, longtime columnist for the Chicago Tribune and one of the country's most insightful observers of race and identity. In Is that okay? You good with
You'll take it.
Take that
okay.
to the bank, yeah.
I can choose some other adjectives. We're good? Okay, all right.
Very fine.
In 1989, Page won the Pulitzer Prize for commentary. His syndicated column currently appears in 150 newspapers across the country. He's also a contributor and commentator for PBS NewsHour, Hardball with Chris Matthews, and NPR's Weekend Edition. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Page.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Big round of applause for our panel. Thank you very much. I've really been looking forward to this. I view this hour as an examination of an underappreciated period. We all, if your upbringing was like mine, you learned a lot about the Civil War. You learned about the Civil Rights Movement. I watched it on television, for that matter. And that period in between, about a century almost, kind of gets short shrift. We can talk about that and the fact that we've got 2 wonderful experts here today on examining these 2 periods. Of course, Isabel Wilkerson, as you have just heard, did her wonderful book, Warmth of Other Suns, and Brooks Simpson, who's done his latest Civil War book and book examining the period after the Civil War, The Words of Reconstruction. This is, in both cases, we're talking about a period that kind of explains so much of our current political landscape, our sociological landscape, our cultural landscape. And I can't wait to get into it, because in some ways, certainly the story of the Great Migration and the story of the slavery period were stories that had deep impact on my family and millions of other families across the country. and examining those periods helps to give us important insights into where we are going. So I would like to first talk to Isabel about that migration period, and then to Brooks about the period that led up to it and the factors that led up to it, and then get to your questions as well. So since I have my faithful timekeeper here to do what I never do, keep track of time. So it's Isabel, I want to say congratulations, and I'm delighted to be on stage with you here today. Your book, in many ways, has been something of a phenomenon among people I know, a lot like Roots was back in the 70s. Stories that help us to, spur us to say, well, what about my family story? What about the community that I live in? And this crosses racial lines. You all remember how popular Roots was, and Isabel, you've kind of become a similar sort of a sought-after figure for the wonderful stories that you reveal. And your book, of course, focuses on that period that affected so many millions of us, so many of our families, and you chose to focus on 3 families in particular to exemplify the period. And I'd like for you to say a little bit, I know you've been asked this a million times, but I'd like to say, first of all, why you picked those 3 families, what is so special about them that can help the rest of us get insight into the period.
Well, thank you for that. I'm honored to be here on so many levels, to be here on the panel with you, also to be here for the second time at the National Book Festival for the same book. I mean, I was here in 2011, and now I'm back here in 2018.
That's going to be a well-worn copy.
It is. This is my version of the copy of the book, and I often say that if this book were a human being, it would be in high school and dating, because it took me 15 years to write the book, and now it's taken over my life in so many other ways. So I'm so thrilled and honored to be back here in Washington, where I am actually from. This was the receiving station of the Great Migration for some of the people who came up from North Carolina, Georgia, and Virginia. So I am a product of the migration to this city. So it's very special and very close to my heart to be here. I chose to work on this book, on this topic, because I agree that this is an underappreciated, unrecognized epoch in our country's history. It is not something that happened in 1 year or 2 years. It actually unfolded from the time of World War I until the 1970s. It involved 6 million African Americans who defected the Jim Crow South to get to what they hoped would be freedom in the North, the Midwest, and West. This means that the majority of African Americans that you might meet in the cities from Washington up to New York and over to Chicago, Detroit, the Midwest, and all the way over to the West Coast, many of these people are actually products of the Great Migration. I view this as a beautifully American story, because many Americans are the products of migration from across the Atlantic Ocean, from across the Pacific Ocean, from across the Rio Grande. It's part of what it's often viewed as being an American often means for many people, other than the natives who were already here, would be to be the descendant of people who did part of what these people did, who left everything in order to set out for what they hoped would be a better life. The difference here is that this Great Migration was the only time in our country's history that American citizens had to leave the land of their birth and to set out for places within the borders of their own country in order to be recognized as citizens. In other words, this is the only time in our country's history these people are the only ones who had to act like immigrants in order to be recognized as citizens. And that's what makes the Great Migration singular in all of the ways that we view migration and immigration in the current time, people coming from outside of the country. I also view, when you think of the Great Migration, you often can think of it as this was the tremendous advance guard that led to the Civil Rights Movement. This was the time from the start of the 20th century. Throughout much of the 20th century was essentially the effort of African Americans to pursue freedom by voting with their bodies to get to what they hoped would be a freer place outside of the place to which they were born. And then also, the goal of this was to connect all of us to what was the unfoldment of what happened in the cities as a result of their arrival. This meant redlining and restrictive covenants. These are the measures that were enacted as a result of the Great Migration of people coming to these cities. So they were fleeing one form of repression only to find a different kind of hostility once they arrived in these places. I chose to tell this story, to answer your question, through the lives of three people because I wanted people who were reading this book many, many years after the migration concluded to feel that they were on the train seats with the people, that they were actually at the kitchen table with the people as they were trying to figure out, should we go or should we stay? What should we do? This was a question that many, many African Americans, in fact, the majority of African Americans, would have had to consider at some point during that time. And that's because before the Great Migration began, 90% of all African Americans were in the South. By the time that the Great Migration ended, nearly half had redistributed themselves all over the rest of the country. And so what this meant was that this was an unfurling of people. This was a spreading out of people throughout the rest of the country. And so that's why this affected so many people. But to have us to be able to see and feel what they went through meant to focus in on three people. So the three people, Ida Mae Brandon Gladney, George Swanson Starling, and Robert Joseph Pershing Foster, were the three people who each represented the three streams of this Great Migration, people who went up the East Coast, from Georgia, Florida, the Carolinas, and Virginia, here to Washington, D.C., to Baltimore and up to the East Coast toward New York. Then there was a Midwest stream which carried people from Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, and Arkansas to Chicago, to Detroit, to Cleveland, and the entire Midwest. And then there was a West Coast stream which carried people from Louisiana and Texas out to California. And when they really wanted to get away, they went to Seattle. And when they really, really wanted to get away, they went to Alaska. That's how far they went. And so each of them represents those three streams. Each of them represents a different socioeconomic experience from which they were all leaving from. They each were leaving for different precipitating reasons, and they also were beautifully imperfect, and they were clear to me about and willing to talk about their imperfections and their decision-making, and that's how I settled on the three, to make this come alive for people.
Well, you're a terrific storyteller, and you also, I just heard a little applause over there, and also, certainly, well, you yourself and your family were in many ways products of the migration, am I right?
Yes, yes, my mother was from Rome, Georgia. And my father was from Petersburg, Virginia, and they migrated during different years, actually different decades, searching for something better, and they met here, married, and here I am. This is a universal story for most Americans anyway, but particularly for African Americans. It's beautifully predictable when you go to a particular city, such as Detroit, and you see that Aretha Franklin, for example, her family was a product of the Great Migration, as were pretty much everybody who was part of Motown. And her father was a sharecropper in Mississippi, migrated to Memphis, then on to Detroit. And so this is just the universal experience of what we view as urban African Americans in the North, Midwest, and West was the story of the Great Migration. That's how people got there.
Now, how much did the pattern of the railroad lines and the black press have to do with the migration?
The railroads were the route the means, the mechanism by which they escaped, and so it was because of the railroads, wherever the railroads were going. You know, the city of New Orleans The Illinois Central Railroad that's of legend was what people in Mississippi were able to take to get to the north. And that route, the tracks that were set by the Illinois Central Railroad determined that people in Mississippi were going to end up in Chicago, and that's how that happened. And
that's how Chicago got so many Mississippi folks.
And a lot of people say it's Mississippi North.
Right.
And so then there also became Harriet Tubmans in so many people's families. I mean, I'm sure that there are people who are descendants of many, many migration streams who will speak about someone in their family who was the first to leave, and then they brought others behind, and that's how families got out.
Well, mine come up on the Baltimore and Ohio, the B&O line, which from Alabama. And just dropped folks off along the way. So I got relatives in Tennessee and right through Ohio, where I grew up, and right all the way to Detroit, and where I used to listen to Aretha Franklin like everybody else. Yeah. But there was a line of, you spent enough time in Chicago, though, to be familiar with Chicago Defender and some of the other black press around the country. What role did they have in spurring the migration?
I view the newspapers in the North, which we should always remember were considered contraband in the South. They were not always, as you know, they were not something that you could just go around. You just couldn't go into a store and buy one. That's where the Pullman porters became essential in helping to make them possible. They would drop them off at a particularly designated spot along the rail line, and that's where people knew, African Americans who were in the South would know that's where to pick them up, and then they would be handed out, spread to people in the South, read at the kitchen tables, could not be seen out with them. But this is what set in motion or gave people an idea of how they might be able to make it in the North. I would consider the black press at that time to be similar to Twitter or Facebook or and also Craigslist in terms of ways of letting people know this is the information, this is what you can do. And there are many, many letters that are written, that were written to the Chicago Defender, saying this is where I am now in Alabama, I'm in Mississippi, things are very hard for us. There are heartbreaking stories that are told through those letters, and they're seeking information. How can I make a go of it? And those articles about what was happening in the North were inspirational for them and gave them a sense of what was possible. So they were newspapers, but they also were mechanisms that would give people an idea of how they could make it happen.
And there was, well, what happened when they got to the North? It wasn't all land of milk and honey.
It was similar to what happens in any migration. I mean, we see that today throughout the world, where people are often, people who are already in a particular place may be resistant to those coming from the outside. We see that they may be cordoned off in places that are reserved for those who are recent arrivals. These people who were leaving were not just, they were not migrants per se, they were actually refugees. They were political refugees seeking political asylum within the borders of their own country. And what occurred is that we see refugee camps in other parts of the world, and that is essentially what happened in most of the cities in the North, Midwest, and West, is that they were cordoned off into segregated areas, which were then enforced by redlining and restrictive covenants, which meant that the people were essentially met with resistance and often hostility. When they sought to leave those spaces that had been reserved for them, then they often met with tremendous hostility and resistance and often violence. One of the people who experienced this was Lorraine Hansberry, who was a product of the Great Migration, father from Tennessee, father from Mississippi, mother from Tennessee, and they arrived, they were on the South Side, as you know so well, and when they sought to buy a house outside of the designated precincts that had been reserved for African Americans from the South, they were met with such tremendous resistance and hostility that they actually were not permitted to move into the house that they had purchased. And a brick that was thrown at the family narrowly missed Lorraine Hansberry's head. She was 7 or 8 years old at the time. And her father had to go all the way to the Supreme Court to win the right to live in the house that they had purchased. So that was one example of the resistance that they met.
You mentioned how what newspapers were treated as contraband that encouraged black folks to move to the North. And Brooks, you can respond to this too. One irony that I noted was that of all that people were trying to escape in the South, that after enough of them escaped, there became a shortage of black folks. Mm-hmm. And so it became virtually criminal to try to leave the South. And I said, gee, they can't live with us, they can't live without us. You know? But it seemed kind of like that. And there was also, as I mentioned, the reception in the North, the 1919 race riots there in Chicago and others around the country, St. Louis and other cities. Right around the time of World War I, really, I'd say, just after World War I we're talking about there. So how would you rate the amount of, the bad news of the migration as far as some families were concerned?
Meaning?
Well, like for example, the hostility in the North, as well as oppression in the South for those who wanted to leave.
Well, yeah, there are lots of people who will look at the Great Migration and see the response to the Great Migration as a kind of commentary on whether it was worth it or not. Mm-hmm. And I think that should be left to the people themselves to determine. Those who had the courage to leave a place that was so repressive that actually there were efforts to keep them from going. There are people who would actually be arrested at the railroad platforms. These are putatively free American citizens. There are people who were arrested in their train seats, and when there were too many people to arrest at the time that they might have been trying to leave, they would actually wave the train on through so that the train would not stop, and then they would have to figure out how now will we get to freedom. So there were tremendous obstacles that they had to face. While the Chicago Defender and the newspapers in New York and also in Pittsburgh were an inspiration, it was up to the people to actually make that decision. They were the ones who were going to have to leave the planter that they were said to owe money to. They were the ones who were going to have to figure out how to get a ticket when the prevailing repressive Jim Crow regime would not allow them to buy a ticket, make it difficult for them to buy a ticket, make it difficult for them to find out what the schedule was. I mean, there's so many incredibly sad, unbelievable stories of people trying to get from one state to another within our country, the borders of our country, within the lifespan of people who may be alive today, that this happened. And that for them to make that great journey, that great sacrifice, to show that kind of courage and perseverance. Remember, there was no Twitter. I'm saying that it was like Twitter, but there was nobody that they could ask for. There was no relocation.com to check and see exactly, where would they be able to get a home beforehand. So this was a tremendous leap of faith on their part, and the people that I had the pleasure and the honor of speaking to, while life had been difficult for them, they'd experienced many challenges in the North, they also felt that they had made the right decision because they themselves had made the decision. I think that we often forget that a lot of this had to do with agency, which is what we're going to be getting to in terms of Reconstruction and the aftermath of Reconstruction, is that this was the first time in 246 years of enslavement, 12 generations of enslavement, followed by 100 years or so of a Jim Crow caste system, meant that during the Great Migration, this was really the first time in the country's history that the lowest caste people had the chance to choose what they would do with their God-given talents and with their choices of what they were going to do, where they would live. It was the first chance that they had to actually act upon their agency. And I think that in itself means that whatever was to come of this, as the Defender once said, whatever was to come of this great leap of faith, it was the leaving that was so important. It was the leaving that made this the epic that it was. It was taking the risk and leaving the place that had been designated to them, both geographically and in terms of the hierarchy of the South. People who could not vote were now making the decision to leave with their bodies, and that was a tremendous thing that they did.
Indeed. I want to give Brooks a chance to respond here in a little different way, in that your book is your latest book is a wonderful collection of documents, letters, essays, editorials, news reports, speeches from different people to really kind of capture what was the foundation of the great debate that followed the Civil War. And well, you lead with one of my favorite people, Frederick Douglass, who, according to the president, is getting more recognized every day. So I'm delighted to see that. The essay is ironic. I want to know why you chose this one, and also what it's about is, and it's not the first time I've read it, but it is an essay to white folks who are questioning what to do. You know, what we used to call the Negro question when I was a kid. Right. You know, what is to be done with the Negro? And Frederick Douglass says the best thing you can do is leave us alone.
Leave us alone and give us a fair chance. That's all we ask for. We don't ask for special privileges. We don't ask for great advantages. We just want to be left alone. And what, you know, when African Americans migrated north, they actually knew that the North was not a land of milk and honey, that in fact, the attitudes of many white Northerners had been very hostile to African American aspirations and the right to vote, for example. And that, in fact, it was the decline, a war weariness, if you will, among many white Northerners in the 1870s that contributed to the collapse of Reconstruction. All Douglass wanted was to say, let us see what we can do on our own. You don't need to help us, but don't get in our way. And unfortunately for African Americans, there were lots of people who wanted to get in the way of defining the question of what did freedom mean after the American Civil War.
And that's a marvel of understatement to say that there was some obstructions. How much did terrorism play a role in Reconstruction? And I'm talking about in the lives and the Great Debate.
I think terrorism, white supremacist terrorism in the American South is fundamental to the collapse of Reconstruction, and that it was overthrown. It didn't so much fail as it was resisted from the beginning. And when people talk about what happened in the United States on September 11th, 2001, and I began to hear terrorism comes from the outside, anyone who looks at Reconstruction sees that terrorism in this sense against African Americans was as American as apple pie. That it is something that starting long before Republicans had outlined a plan of Reconstruction, there's already terrorist activity against African Americans immediately after the Civil War. And continuing on, city of Memphis in 1866, African American veterans just discharged are attacked by city officials. In 1873, in Colfax, Louisiana, upwards of 100 African Americans slaughtered in cold blood. These are things that today's Americans sometimes don't want to look at, because Reconstruction had both a face of hope and opportunity and a very ugly face of resistance to that hope and opportunity.
I've been amazed over the years whenever I've written about the period I call the lynching period, really, Reconstruction, the period leading up to the Great Migration and all. How many letters I've gotten, well, these days emails, from white readers mostly, who are not angry or upset. They are amazed and surprised that they didn't know about this, or that they heard about lynching, but they didn't realize how extensive it was.
No, I think that's one thing that we tend to have underplayed, the degree to which racial violence, anti-black violence was prevalent in the United States in the mid-19th century, including Reconstruction. That we also overlooked the fact that the 17th president of the United States, usually ranked as one of the worst presidents, although these things may change over time.
It's kind of an ongoing contest, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes, it is. But that he was, in fact, hostile towards African American aspirations, including Frederick Douglass. The two men had an encounter in which Johnson treated Douglass rather badly. And we have to remember that between 1865 and 1869, a staunch opponent of black equality happened to be in the White House, and it wouldn't be until 1869 that, in fact, there would be a president who at least had some glimmer of hope for African-American aspirations.
And that was Grant.
That was Grant.
And how would you contrast, for us folks who aren't that old, how would you contrast Johnson and Grant? as far as not just their approaches, but also how were they perceived by African Americans in particular? I mean, you have an interesting piece that Douglass wrote about Grant, but anyway, I'll let you answer.
The two men, it's interesting because the two men did share certain things. Ulysses S. Grant, in fact, is the last slaveholder elected president of the United States. That Grant actually owned a slave in the 1850s, married into a slaveholding family of William Jones.
Okay.
But married into a slaveholding family when he lived in St. Louis with his in-laws. And so therefore he's the last slaveholder to be president of the United States. You can always win a Jeopardy contest by pointing that out to people. But the fact of the matter is that Grant grew when it came to issues of race. He saw African Americans fight for their freedom during the American Civil War, became an advocate of African Americans in uniform. Then he began to become an advocate of black voting after he began to see that African Americans needed to be armed with the vote in order to protect themselves. And in fact, in 1868, that's the first presidential election in which a large number of African Americans participate, and their popular vote gave Grant a popular majority. Grant would have still won in the Electoral College had only white people voted, but it's the tens and hundreds of thousands of African Americans who vote for Grant that give him that popular majority. And Grant, as president, then fights for black rights, supervises the ratification of the 15th Amendment, sees that as the capstone of the repudiation of the Dred Scott decision. But by the mid-1870s begins to understand that many whites in the United States, North as well as South, no longer have the heart to fight for black freedom the way that African Americans did. And he talks about this, that in this, there's a document in this book on January 13th, 1875, Grant talks about how we in this boasted land of Christianity and civilization can allow this to happen while the miscreants of the Colfax Massacre, the people who committed that massacre, go unwhipped of justice. And if an American president ever put it squarely in front of the American people about the importance of race and the failure to live up to the nation's ideals, it would be that message to the United States Senate.
I was intrigued by the parallels I began to pick up with the politics of those days and the politics of today and the issues. We mentioned violence, racial violence, also voter suppression, registration, who is a citizen, who isn't, who's got rights and who doesn't. Time is short, so let me just put to you my number one question that I've been burning to ask you. Who won the Civil War?
Let's put it this way. Reconstruction defines for Americans, white and black, what the Civil War accomplished for that generation. That while people will talk about how the Reconstruction Amendments, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, Civil Rights Act of 1866, Civil Rights Act of 1875, would set up the foundation of the second civil rights movement in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. The fact is that between 1865 and 1877, I would argue what happens is that in order to welcome back white Southerners, the former Confederates, into the Union, white Northerners and white Southerners alike agreed that that would come at the expense of black freedom, despite black assertions to the contrary. Blacks did not take this passively. They fought against this as much as possible. But by the 1870s, reunion trumps racial justice. And that's something that many, many Americans were complicit in that result among American whites, both North and South.
Yes, Isabel.
I believe that the experience with Charlottesville and all that's happened in recent years have been an indication that clearly the North won the war, but the South won the peace. Mm-hmm. And
hope you all heard that. The North won the war, the South won the peace.
And I think that the people of the Great Migration, who essentially were African Americans in the South who decided to leave, knew that. They could see that things were not going to change in their lifetime. Things were not going to change anytime soon. In fact, during that time, in the years after Reconstruction ended and there was a reclaiming of it, which you would be more expert in than I, but the time where there was no longer a financial investment in black bodies, That's when lynchings began to rise to such a level at a certain period of time. The first 3 decades of the 20th century, there was a lynching every 4 days somewhere in the American South. And a lot of people, I think, don't realize what a lynching actually is. It's not just someone's been killed. It is a ritualistic public execution that's that's performative in order to send a message to everyone in that caste system as to who could do what in that world. And I think that the people in the Great Migration, African Americans in the South at that time, recognized that things were not going to change, and that's where they made their great leap of faith into what they hoped would be better. I believe that they knew that they were not looking to become, builders of skyscrapers and captains of industry per se. They were looking to be able to live out their lives without the repressive violence and terror, and to be able to be whoever they were in their minds and in their hearts.
Right. Well, one question that comes up is when we're talking about, Civil War in 1865, the Great Migration, as by your account, began around World War I. People have different ideas as to when it actually began, but I'm curious to ask you the question of why did it take us, our families, the migrants, so long to begin the Great Migration, if you will? And you also mentioned in the book, you make a passing mention to the first generation not to be born in slavery, which reminds me of South Africa, where I've also worked. They refer to the born-free generation, the born-frees being those born after apartheid. So, but I'd like to ask you, why do you think it took so long for the migration?
Yeah, so these were the children and grandchildren of people who were enslaved at the time of the Civil War, and so they were also, there was a greater disconnect between them and the world of enslavement and all of the protocols and expectations of deference and all of that. It was a totally new generation. Also, of course, the biggest issue was World War I and the fact that the North had been relying on labor from Europe, and with World War I on, that meant that labor was no longer available to the North, and the North needed workers. And so the Great Migration began, actually. This is something that when you see how African Americans are often viewed, seen, and have been treated in the time since they've been in the North, it doesn't make sense when you hear this, but the first arrivals were actually invited here. It was a northern industry that went north and began to recruit African Americans as workers to come and work in the factories and the steel mills and the railroads and all of that in the north. And so that meant that the first arrivals were actually invited here, in spite of the resistance, hostility, and actually the mechanisms that were used to restrict them upon arrival. But that meant that they came because they came to work. They had an opportunity, they could see that there was a way that they could take care of their families. And that's what began this great wave of people.
And at the same time, what you got at that moment is the rise in American historiography of the so-called Dunning School, which condemned Reconstruction as a failure, the election of the first Southerner since the Civil War to the presidency, Woodrow Wilson, and the 50th anniversary of the end of the American Civil War. Wilson speaking at Gettysburg in 1913 and the like. That this became, we like then at this point to call this the Brothers' War, that this was just a disagreement between brothers, and African Americans were getting taken out of the picture of what happened during the American Civil War. Later on, people would be very surprised to hear that nearly 200,000 African Americans served in the armies of the United States during that war. And in fact, when we talk about the Union versus the Confederacy, we will forget the Confederacy fights war against the United States of America. A man responsible for the death of more United States military personnel than any other is Robert E. Lee. And we ought to remember that's one of the reasons that Arlington is established.
You're a brave man to say that so close to Virginia here.
Just look across the bridge. I'm a UVA boy, so I've been through this before from Charlottesville.
You're okay then. When I came here from the land of Lincoln, to cover Doug Wilder's campaign. In fact, I was greeted by a couple of Virginians who said, you know how many people it takes to change a flat tire, how many UVA students it takes to change a flat tire? And the answer was 1 to get the new tire, 1 to get the beer, and 3 to reminisce about how beautiful the old tire was.
Absolutely.
Indeed, but I was, oh, by the way, is that 2 minutes to questions or 2 minutes to the end? To the end, oh my Lord, this is zipping ahead too fast. Let me ask, I just forgot the next question I was going to ask. It was a real doozy too. Let me just jump to Martin Luther King's question, which he raised in the last year of his life. Where do we go from here? And I'll let, since you spoke last here, Brooks, let me ask you, Isabel. We talk about the parallels with the politics today of what was going on back in Reconstruction time and the debate being similar. What do you see in our knowledge of Reconstruction and the Great Migration that can help to inform our decisions about the future?
What a question, and we've got, 30 seconds, I've just used up 10 of them.
You never worked in television, did you?
In the short time that I have to say anything, I would just say that when people do read the book that I've written, and it's been out a while now, the thing that I hear over and over and over again from all backgrounds is, I had no idea. And I think it's time for people to get an idea. Mm-hmm. I think it's time for people to get an idea. Yeah, reacquaint ourselves with our country. If we didn't know it before, we need to know it now.
I've always thought in Washington, the very interesting thing is to go to the Jefferson Memorial, where we're told that all men are created equal. And then you walk out in front of the memorial, and you look at Dr. King, arms crossed, saying, "Show me."
Well put, indeed. Boy, it's hard to, yes, the little sign says wrap it up, and it's hard to, my wife wants to borrow that from you. Sitting right down the road here. But let me say, this is indeed, you've whetted our appetites today, I hope, because there is so much that we don't know. One of my questions to you was going to be, what do we get wrong? Because you mentioned this before, how most people get the Civil War history and Reconstruction history wrong. And we really need to know a lot. And I think if we wonder why, just look at the great decisions being made right here in Washington these days about our future. Look to the leaders who know something about history and those who don't. I'm not going to name any names, but I'm sure Frederick Douglass will be happy to advise him. So with that in mind, I want to thank the Library of Congress, the National Humanities, the National Endowment for the Humanities for giving me this opportunity. And these authors will be available for autographs and books later on the day. Thank you all for coming.